Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the On Publishing IWE symposium. This afternoon, we're looking forward to having an informal conversation of sorts with our guests. Uh, this conversation slash discussion will be moderated by Professor Anna Kurian, the principal investigator of IWE Online. Over to you, Anna ma'am.
So we had planned this with three members, panel discussion, moderator, all of that. As we know, we make our plans. But yeah, the well-laid plans, etc. fall apart. So now we'll just have a discussion, a conversation. I have a list of conversation starters which were provided to me by Meenakshi as well as Pramod. So I hope to take off from where the morning ended, where Karthika talked about how there is this bestseller culture, how it keeps evolving and changing, and now books are no longer seen as standalone. Also, of course, the dire prognosis, right? That books are dying. Coming from a publisher, I guess we ought to take it seriously. But I would also like to then begin with this idea that how do we then think about the other variants along that spectrum? Because she said the audiobook, she said other kinds of publishing. So do we think of, and you people as students who supposedly read, what are the things that we read? Or how do we read? Where do we read? So beginning with them, but of course later on it will be opened up to you guys as well.
I didn't. Did I say books are dying?
You said that the publishing industry is in dire straits.
I said a certain. Okay, no. Let me rephrase that. A certain part of the publishing industry is thriving because one is working with the trends. One is working with what is actually the popular, what is actually commercially viable, etc. So that is like the monster that is growing. And that is threatening to engulf everything else. So what we would really like people to read and what we think that people would actually benefit from reading, that segment is getting swallowed up by the purely commercial. So there are two sides to that. One is that it's not like profit is dirty word. We all want to make profits. We all want to have better lives, all of that. But I'm thinking that increasingly there is a sense of distancing from what allows that profit to be made. If a certain kind of world, it doesn't matter what I say, right? Okay, so if you were to do a lot of books on Godse and try and build up Godse as this valorous figure who deserves to be re-examined, etc., it's okay to an extent, but it's not okay beyond that point. But if that's what people want to read, and by creating more material in that, you get them to read, then I think you're actively feeding into that feeding frenzy at the moment. And so somewhere we're losing grasp of what publishing can and should be doing, as opposed to being a profit-making machine. And that is the deeper worry, not so much by books dying or but I think we are now becoming a tool which is being used quite effectively, specifically by the right, to encourage a certain kind of conversation.
So that, I'll come back to my earlier question as well, but maybe Urvashi would like to contribute to this.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. So I would say, not that books are dying, I think it's the printed book, the form of the printed book, which isn't today what it was earlier. And of course, there's a whole range of Karthika's talking about the content, but I want to just bring in a little bit of historical perspective on the printed book and what it meant, because the death of the printed book, or the imminent death or departure, or whatever you call it, of the printed book, is a historical thing which relies on certain things. So before, printed books came into existence in the middle of the 15th, 16th centuries when Gutenberg, the German guy called Gutenberg, invented or discovered what was already known, which was printing from movable type. So previous to that, how did we have books in the world? We had books written on palm leaf manuscripts in cultures and civilizations like ours, where animal skins, particularly the skins of small calves, were forbidden by the use for use because we were largely Hindu country. So instead, books were created on palm leaves in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, etc., other cultures. Elsewhere in the world, you had books on what's called vellum, which is animal skin, and the skin of small calves, and that often took as many as, I think some figure, I can't remember exact, 300 skins to actually get a whole book of X number of pages, and it became unsustainable after a while to be able to do that as the market expanded and books became products of mass consumption, the mass being understood differently at that time, as opposed to being kept in a place largely filled with religious or kingly, if you like, religious dictums or knowledge of conquest or travel, where you could go and read it, access it, and everybody didn't have access. So as access democratized, and this happened in the West, particularly because of the Industrial Revolution, it also happened with the spread of paper. So paper, which we take as a given for books, actually only came into the book industry in the 18th century, although it had been discovered long ago by the Chinese. But it was with the spread of Islam that paper is carried by the Arabs across the world. And in the early days, there was a huge amount of suspicion among publishers of paper. They used to think, what is this substance? It's ephemeral, it won't last long. Because the skins that they were using, the leaves that they were using, and in some cases the cloths that they were using, were things that seemed to have a permanence which paper supposedly did not have. So they would do the rough draft of a book on paper and the actual book on one of these surfaces, one of these substances. And then paper became something worldwide. Today, paper itself is unsustainable. Why? Because paper is made from wood. Wood comes from trees. Paper needs huge quantities of water. We are in a moment of climate change. Neither of these commodities is going to be easily available in the world. So in a sense, the disappearance of the book is also driven by these changes around us. That's one thing. The second thing, I think, is the change which Karthika has been talking about, the deep change in reading patterns. So given the huge amount of information that the net makes available, the paucity of time in our completely hectic lives where we are sitting with our phones all the time and doing 20 things all the time, it becomes really difficult to read a full-length book. Even for somebody like Karthika and I, who are readers to the core, I read much less now of full-length books than I used to before. So your reading patterns change. So in a sense, the content has to change to adapt to those reading patterns. It's like when film music in India moved out of films and became independently available as individual songs, the film industry had to think, how are we going to make money out of this, right? So they then did this thing of subscribing and all of that, YouTube subscribers, advertisements. The book publishing industry has to think of that. So reading is not going anywhere. Knowledge is not going anywhere. Content is being shaped and misshaped in the ways that Karthika has so beautifully pointed out. The form of the book will change. But actually people will continue to read because the hunger for knowledge will never go away. It's just that we might be obsolete as publishers.
No, but my kids, for instance, who are teenagers, they have a much broader understanding of the world than I take.
Because there's so much knowledge available.
But sadly, they're not readers. But they consume words in the form of video and audio in such a sort of almost understanding way to start with till they find what they want, and then they go much deeper into that rabbit hole of finding further into that same thing, and then it's like a different way of understanding the world, but also sharing it, because then they immediately will share it with XYZ through links and whatever, in the way that we could never do with books so much, like underlining the text and passing it on is a very different way of doing. Now it's like instantly. Have you seen this? Have you read this? And then let's talk about it.
Yeah, but Karthika, that's exactly what I'm saying, that the form might disappear, but the hunger for knowledge is not going anywhere.
My worry is that while the format of the book, the physical book may not work at some point, maybe we thought the e-book would work, then people would still want to switch, but that's not working. So it's not as though the physical book is being replaced by the e-book or the Kindle reader or whatever. No. So it's not so much reading a written text as listening to the spoken word that seems to be taking over.
That could be, maybe reading. But one of the experiments that we tried out was, Srinath is not here, he was going to speak about academic publishing. We do a lot of academic publishing as well. So we do lots of collections of essays. It will be on violence against women, on XYZ. So what we did was, about 5 or 6 years ago, we took all the essays we had published in different books and we made them individually available from our website in a curated thing. So each fortnight we would curate a set of 10 essays on a particular subject, sexual violence. 10 essays from across 20 books we have sourced. People could buy the individual essay. Okay, and we found the response to that was really interesting because people wanted a curated list. They would pick up those individual essays and so on. We gave that up only because it needed somebody to actually read and curate. And I was doing that most of the time because I knew all the books. But how much can one person do? So you need to have a whole system. But that was so interesting to see that people were willing to pick up, also because each essay was 100 rupees. And if you could, for every 3 essays, you would get 1 free essay, something like that. So, it sort of worked quite well. It's like JSTOR and places like that work for academics. So you subscribe, you can pick up stuff, something like that. Those things also, I think those needs need to be seen and experimented with.
So I think students might have a take on this. Can we alter the format so that they can ask questions for this particular segment? Because several of them do not have hard copy books in their hands anymore in classes. They read on their phones. Apart from some teachers who say that that's not acceptable and you have to have hard copy. Most of our students, I think, read on their phones. They bring in small reading devices. They have tabs. They have Kindles. So would any of you like to respond to what our two resource people are talking about, or experts are talking about? As to how you read and why the reading has changed. Yes, please. Something here. You want to? No need, okay. You could come a little in front if you will.
My name is Karthika. Here I am from School of Medical Sciences. My graduation was homeopathy. And I would like to add to the point that was put by Madam. It is 2 years back, I was a child who had a disorder disease called ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. He was brought to me, and I was training him on about 2 to 3 visits per week. What happened was, initially when he came to my library, he was having that problem. Every 2 to 3 minutes his attention get diverted and he would be staring up to the sky. So he was like, why sir you read this much books and what is the necessity of doing that? So he told me like that, and he was very much indifferent about the person who is reading. He is entirely based on it. It is kind of the attitude of these teenagers of this era. And once I understood that he is much more adapted to audio or hearing and getting the content, I asked to read the book, audiobooks of some books that would inspire. And right now, some days he had got passed +2 right now recently, and NMI University is doing DBA. And once in a while he used to call and ask me, sir, which is the book that you are reading now? May I know whether the audiobook of that is available? Right now he used to read 3 books at least once in a week. In a week he used to read, but in an audio form. So the children are, as Nana have told, they know much more than us, and they have access in different ways to the content that we are doing. So it must be appreciated, since this kind of some papers related to ADHD saying that these kind of disorders are much more increasing. It is due to these kind of digital platforms increasing. Students are getting diverted from within a few span of time. So in that kind of a era, this kind of audio book perform much better than what older people have used to do, because their focus is getting reduced. So for them, they don't have that patience anymore. And we cannot train as a whole, because this needs much more individual attention and individual practice and all. So for them, acquiring knowledge through that would be much more better, and they have much more knowledge than I used to ask him about the books he had read. I used to do the twist content of that, and he may even suggest books to me. I may not be able to complete 3 books in a week, but with this audio, they can adjust the and speed, and they can get access to much more volume of knowledge than what we used to.
Thank you. Something here, I put up my hand. Yes, please, Robert.
The discussion on how people in the generation tends to read less of hard copies and more of material that is, say, published online, or read more from electric devices. That is one point I found interesting. There's this book, HarperCollins Book of Indian English Poetry, and in that volume I have come across texts that at first sight do not appear to resemble a poem, as in they seem to be in the form of a prose paragraph, say, or a diary entry. They read like a diary entry in the first read. And I've noticed that some of my friends, not from here, some of my friends during my graduation, they would also give these texts maybe a second or a third read, even though at first reading they are not convinced that they are poems. They would give it a second and third reading because they say, oh, it appeared in the HarperCollins Book of Poetry, therefore it must have a certain associated legitimacy. But I've noticed that if the same thing had appeared in, say, a website, people may not necessarily give it the same same worth, as in they will say, okay, they didn't have much to lose here, because when it appears in print, there's investment involved, I suppose. Both commercial as well as, I don't get the word for, not academic perhaps, but a certain legitimacy that's associated with the published word, published in the physical sense.
Yeah. True. So curated content is where it's at. Because let's say the published book or on a website, it's curated in a particular manner, then that gives it a certain legitimacy.
And then it's I suppose a middle person who is the purveyor of that, or who is the supposedly objective, rather than you putting it up yourself.
I worked on that book. I'm curious to know who this prose poet is that you're talking about.
I don't recall it right now, but I'll find out and
Okay. No, because there's that whole notion of what's it called, concrete poetry, right?
Prose poetry as well.
Yeah, and prose poetry as well. So some of the poems, why I'm saying this is because that particular volume was intended almost to be part of that canonical, let's create an anthology that students in particular and people who want to study poetry will be able to recognize. And there were, when there's someone editing a volume like that, there's always preferences that they have which come into the picture, right? So I remember in this particular anthology, for instance, at virtually the last minute, we were like, no, but these say 5 or 6 poets had not been included at all. And it was as good as, but I don't really like it anymore. You know, so whatever. So then the publishers, so we were like, no, that's not good enough. You have to. They are among the well-known and among the best poets in the language at the moment. So then they have to be called. And I was thinking how quickly, if that is the kind of legitimacy a student ascribes to an anthology, then how important that personal preference and the decisions made along that, how long that impact will last. It's not something that publishers very often think about. So it's something to clock, okay, that one should be really careful about putting these anthologies out with that kind of branding strongly, because when you're expecting it to be taken that seriously, then you'd better get your material absolutely right. So,
but you have suggested to us that when you said the making of a canon, it is a canonical undertaking that you're doing when you are putting together an anthology for us. We pick it up and teach it probably.
Yeah, so that sense of responsibility that a publisher better have to make sure that when we do the right thing by it, I think that's something to make sure we do for it.
What should we feel?
I believe that when we move on to other medium, like audiovisual medium, we are trying to replicate a book format. For example, let's say e-books and audiobooks. They are mediated through a reader, like Kindle or Audible, for example. And they try as much as to replicate a book, a physical book with options to have chapters, bookmarks, percentage, and time left for the book. So I guess what we are doing is we have not fully transitioned into different mediums. We still stick to the physical format in other versions.
Right. That even though it might be on a Kindle, it's still a book in that sense.
More or less a book, because they try to replicate the.
So does that change? Would you, as publishers, have an insight into whether the actual form of a book changes in different media?
Oh, yeah, I mean, yes, it does. For example, when you're reading an e-book, it's still a book, but you're not reading the e-book as you see it in a book. You know, as you will see the pages in the book, the e-book pages don't look like that. They look a bit different, although they're still pages, but they're not the same. But especially if you're looking at a book with illustrations, or if you're looking at a photographic book where the pictures bleed to the edge of the page, the e-book format that I don't make our e-books, but what I think I know is a format that is premised on a certain frame of margins and so on within which the thing fits. Now, if you have an illustrated book and let's say you have a picture that's leading off the page and you have a text, but the page doesn't have margin format, then those things are going to go all over the place. And it becomes very difficult to connect one with the other, because if the text and the visual are acting as a composite text, this is what I understand. I could be wrong. Do you know this?
Yeah, no, so I see what you mean about the book being more or less a book. I mean, whether even when even that percentage thing in the Kindle about how much is left to read is trying to imitate the fact that if you were reading a physical book, you would have a sense of how much you had left, which you can't get obviously in the page. But what is very interesting now is that when you exercise the rights to a book in the sense of other formats, you have audio rights, so you will do an audiobook, or you might have an ebook, or you have the ebook rights. Then there's these other audio rights, what they call other audio rights. And I think within that space, there's some experimentation going on, where, for instance, podcasts, right? A book becomes something where each chapter then becomes this talk. It's a kind of conversational discussion of what that material in that chapter is. Like there was this very well-known one in the US, I forget, it was like an investigative story of a true crime. And true crime is one of those categories that have gone very much from the physical book thing to other conversations. And they basically made a whole podcast where this person is investigating the murder and why, what happened. And so it was very different from the book. And similarly now they have these, again I'm forgetting the name of the thing, the platform.
The QR codes that come in books?
No, this is the videos. There's a very popular thing where basically what they do is there's a video that summarizes the book and that tells you what. So you've not read any of these books, but you're never going to get around to reading them. But all you have to do is to go there and they give you a beautiful summary of the book and get into the essence of it and the understanding of it. And this is done with permission, copyright permission. It's not like you're just sitting there and saying, okay, I'll just give you the summary of the book. It's done very intelligently, thoughtfully. So I often think that maybe that is where we will end eventually. That people won't read the whole book, but they'll be really interested in knowing in like 10 minutes and a really cleverly done video and with graphics and animation, what happened, how it happened, why it happened, the strength of this, the literary core of this book, etc., etc. And you read the book, you absorbed it, osmosis happened there. That's possibly one direction this future of book and content writing might take.
Maybe authors will end up writing like that.
Yeah, maybe they will.
Get this thing. Yeah. But there's also, I was reminded when you were talking, that's why I mentioned QR codes. And for example, in Australia, I know publishers who are publishing books by Aboriginal writers. And embedded in the books are these QR codes that you can scan and you can hear those books written in the spoken in the language of the Aborigines. So this multimedia thing is also entering the space quite interesting.
There was a time when there was, I remember on Kindle itself, going through a David Attenborough book, and embedded in that were little videos of David Attenborough speaking about that particular species from the film, etc. And I forget what it was called. It was not called Kindle. I think this was somebody else's invention. And there was a time when everybody said this is going to be the future of it. The reading come video version. But interestingly, it seemed to turn out that the reader wanted to read and the viewer wanted to view. And putting them both together didn't work. They sort of shut that down more or less. It seemed like it was too disruptive of both experiences. So it didn't take off.
What Urvashi was saying about the audio bits inside the book, or what you were saying about the it's also very reminiscent of what somebody like Ram Devanani did with Priya Shakti, which came after the Nirbhaya incident, after Nirbhaya rape incident. It's a graphic novel online, and it's a comic book essentially about sexual assault, and at the end of it, you find this small audio file with actual rape victims talking about their experiences. So they're anonymized, they don't tell us who these rape victims are, but then you still get to hear, the oppressed speak. So that's like one experience over there, and it's a little haunting as well over there. And what he did was he also painted these walls across Mumbai with graffiti, and there you had it was the first example of an augmented reality comic that came out in India really. So you could scan the wall, there would be a QR system, I'm supposing, and that would take you straight to the comic. And then the comic sort of expanded into this whole pedagogical exercise of educating schools and colleges about sexual assault, etc. This came in the aftermath of the incident. That's one thing. The other thing I was thinking about is he started off by asking all the students like, what are you doing to read? How are you reading? And then you spoke about how these short bite-sized things are what are getting us to read. So I mean, they aren't very different from curated newsletters, are they? Because when I think of where my favorite reading comes from, or how I identify these eclectic sources that I want to go and read up immediately, they come from these. I'm sure a lot of us read these newsletters, like the Brain Pickings newsletter is a very popular one with Maria Popova writes, and she beautifully picks on a theme and then talks about how all of these canonical, non-canonical writers have written about these themes. You have the Alipur Post, which is like a very popular newsletter right now, and he or she does the same thing. They pick up on one particular theme and then try to talk about all of this diversity of literature that's found around of these. JSTOR, which you mentioned, has the JSTOR daily newsletter, which comes out I think once every week or once every month, and that gives you bite-sized summaries of actual academic papers, but written in a way that the layperson can understand, and they want to go and read up the research behind it. So it's a very social media-ish tactic, because you have like a short paragraph over there that tries to, it has a hook and it tries to hook you in, and then you go and read something that's long form. So it's working in tandem over here. A newsletter is a form of long form reading, because there's so much over there, but it still tries to give you, using all of these pictures or quotes or something that can draw you in, essentially using the same principle that social media also uses to draw you in.
Actually, Meenakshi, this is happening a lot across many reading platforms. For example, the Economic and Political Weekly has this, I forget what it's called, the name is right here. It's a set of short papers that they do, and it's a online graphic thing. So they'll have a thing on the women's movement, and they'll have a visual, and imagine a procession, a feminist march. Everybody's holding placards. One placard is saying no violence against women, one is saying no dowry. You can click on those, and they will take you to pieces that you can read, and then they will link to longer pieces. So a lot of people are doing this kind of thing, but I have a question for you. Do you like those Devanini comics, graphics, graphic stories that he did? That methodology was used also by a number of artists campaigning against violence against women, and they would put up pictures on the walls in Calcutta, and then they would provide all sorts of things. But I have to say, it's one thing to, this is my feminist critique, it's one thing to produce a comic and sell it as a first statement on violence against women in India. That's a load of crap, because the feminist movement in India has been talking about violence against women in India ever since it started, long before Ram Devanini made his presence felt in this world, arriving from America. One thing. Second, those women were like, those women in his comics were like Wonder Woman, huge breasts, tiny waists, big buttocks. I mean, what are you doing? You're doing something which is supposedly about violence against women, and you're objectifying and stereotyping women in the worst possible way. I'm sorry, this is all being recorded. Please take it off your website. Don't put this on our website, because just, in a sense, I was intrigued to hear you speak about it, because there is such a kind of critical eye to be passed on content like that. So it may be the first in something, and which is also not true, because whatever we think is the first in something is never the first in something. There's always something else that's preceded it. But I just think, I don't know.
You are right, because he also called it Priya Shakti, and so immediately paints it in with a certain political, religious, cultural light. So you are right, there is a lot of criticism to be said for it, but the format itself was intriguing, because he did manage to convert it into something that could be used as an exercise, that could be used in schools, for example. It expanded. It started off with something about sexual assault. It went on to acid attack victims. It went on to COVID. Right now, the COVID comics aren't as impactful as the ones that came before, because he is also, I think, being lured by the commercial more and more. But I think the format itself is interesting that way.
Okay, I'll grant you that.
Also, these newsletters you were talking about, I think in some ways that stepped into the shrinking review spaces that we have for books. So while the Hindu continues to have an impact with its literary page, wherever it does on the page, the others are more or less doing the perfunctory occasional book talk or review or whatever. And these newsletters, many of them written by people who read and talk really interestingly about books, are now becoming a very important part of that ecosystem for us as publishers as well. So we turn to them to say things about books that will then reach an audience that is already geared to, respecting their opinion, have subscribed to them. So maybe they'll go out and even follow up by buying that book. So those newsletters are now possibly the most interesting conversation points for what's interesting in publishing, what's working for books, which writer to read. All of that is happening within that space.
Anna, I know you have a question to ask, but I just want to come back to this thing. I think another thing you might be interested in looking at, if you don't know it, but I'm sure some of you know it, is cover leheria. So the beginnings from 5 or 7 women Dalit collective printing a newspaper by hand in Banda, 100 copies, 150 copies, to today being an online force of nature almost with thousands and thousands of subscribers nationally and internationally, to also they have, this, you're talking about getting the material into schools and so on. What Cover Leheria has now done is set up an academy called the Chambal Academy, which is to train poor rural women as journalists. And they are training them, and these women are now doing reporting and writing. And a number of books will eventually come out of it. One is already coming out of it, but other books will come out of it. So there are a whole lot of things like that which are happening.
So I would like to go back to what Ross spoke about, poetry. And because poetry seems to have shrinking space in publishing as well today. Lots of poets are self-published. And what would you say about the poetry, publishing of poetry in English?
So at Western, for instance, we publish something like 2 volumes of poetry every year. And we choose our poets the way, manuscripts come in, people we know, we recognize, etc. So that's 2 books out of maybe 80 books, 2 will be poetry collections, because you cannot sell poetry. Literally, it's the hardest thing to sell collections of poetry. Even if you print 1,500 copies, you'll end up with selling 700 copies. Occasionally, you might, I'm not talking about the film-led poetry, like you sell Prasun Joshi or Gulzar or not like that, but like the poet writing in English. We recently published Sharmishta Monti's new collection of poetry. It's exquisite. And it gets really good reviews and everyone loves it. But to sell 1,000 copies or 1,500 copies, we probably end up taking like 2 years or something. So you can't afford simply that. You can only publish so many books. The printer's bills will be the same. The return to the market will take that many years. So you just tend to be cautious and say, I just feel constantly thankful that all these years I've always managed to put out 2 volumes of poetry in a year. And that in itself seems like something that's almost like a battle won, even if you don't have to actually fight.
And there's one.
We don't publish poetry at all. Although we publish, let's say we have published some poetry which is mainly historical. We publish Andal, we have published translations of Lal Ded, Hapa Khatun, that kind of thing. But we don't publish contemporary modern poetry. For the reason that Karthika says, it's very difficult to sell. If you go into a bookshop, let's say, you pick up a volume of poetry which is like 100 poems, it'll be 100 pages long, or 60 poems, it'll be 60 pages long. You will stand there and leaf through it, you'll have read half of it, and you'll think, okay, why do I need to buy it and put it back? That's generally what happens. Which is tragic, because, of course, as you also said, poetry kind of stays with us. To me today, I studied Emily Dickinson when I was in college, which is like a century ago. Her lines are still imprinted in my mind, and they come back to me at times when something reminds me of those. But it is a difficult form, and we don't publish it because, frankly, I don't know how to take a call on what is good poetry, what is publishable poetry, and what is not, because in my head there are no criteria by which I can judge it. And what often happens is poetry is often a personal kind of outpouring. Everybody is a poet at some stage in their lives, and they want to get it published, and it is simply not publishable, and I cannot bear to A, not read, and B, hurt all those people and say, listen, I can't publish this because it's just not good enough. So I tend to stay away.
No, because it's something which as academics, we are constantly looking at the fact that our poetry, much of it is the older generation still, which we are teaching in our classes. And the newer poets, you see maybe one volume of poetry comes out and after that they suddenly disappear off the scene. So publishing poetry seems to be this kind of really.
I think publishing poetry is suffering because there's no support for it outside of the poet and the publisher. There isn't even a poets community. I ask poets that we publish whether they read the other poets we publish. They don't. Then I ask people who teach poetry, have you read anything recently published? They haven't. So I don't know what to do. Like, why would you not spend 500 rupees to read a contemporary poet if that same argument holds that this is curated and brought together by someone? These collections of poetry are also eventually ones that have been picked and chosen and published. Why do students not go out and say, I want to study one new poet every year? There's virtually no support at any level, from academia, from reviewers, from anybody else.
Actually, this is something that again Karthika was referring to earlier. Publishing in many countries, publishing gets a lot of support from the state. A lot of support without any interference or censorship, because many states have the enlightened belief that the creation of knowledge about those countries, their countries, is something that needs to be supported. Many countries have translation programs. So if I want to translate a Japanese novel tomorrow, I can go to the Japan translation program and they will give me a grant and they will support me for publicity and promotion, and I will be able to translate that work and publish it, and they don't want any money for it. Their thing is, we need to get our literature out into the world, and we need to encourage people to create literature. So in Canada, you have government support for independent publishers. The only condition is you first have to publish 4 books. If you publish 4 books, the state will support you for the next 3 years. You pay salaries to do everything. In India, there is zero support for publishers. The state thinks we are completely useless. They think we need to be, just unattended to or wiped out. There is no investment in creating knowledge. In Indian languages, some states will buy back books and send them out to libraries. For example, Tamil Nadu is doing something wonderful now in getting Tamil literature out into the world, so they are subsidizing translations and so on. But it's very, very rare. So there's no support. We don't even get support for booking stalls at book fairs. So it's really like you're out there on a limb trying to bear every cost on your own, and it's not easy.
Which is why I guess the profit-making publishing makes sense at one level, because it can then be used to subsidize the other publishing which you think of as more meaningful and if possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, would you say that given that we are supposed to be among, I think, the second largest publisher of English books in the world, what is our audience for reading it? And this is something which actually you wouldn't have spoken about this morning. Yes, not just numbers, like who are people who are reading in English? So there are different kinds of readers.
Yeah, there are different kinds of readers for different. So the diversification that has happened in the last many years has, I suppose, expanded the pool of readers. I mean, the gurus are being read by their followers, and the young adult readers are reading their books. So there's many kinds of books that are being published now, as opposed to the earlier sort of narrower number of categories we had. Young people, I'm astonished at the numbers sometimes. We have this thing called the Nielsen Book Scan, which is kind of tabulates the number of books sold from about maybe 50-60% of the market in the English language trade space. I look at the numbers of that sometimes. Yesterday we were looking at some. I don't know if you've heard about a writer called Anita Krishan. I think she is. Have you heard about something like that? No. I have not heard about her. No. And the book is called Haunted something. It seems to have sold some 30,000-40,000 copies. And it's horror or something like that. So there's these new kinds of books that are coming along, being sold. They're invisible to most everyone. They're not being talked about, they're not looked at, but there are people reading them. And I see this a lot in the Pratilipy app, because now Western is within this universe of Pratilipy, which is a digital publishing platform in various Indian languages. English is there too, but that's not their priority. Mostly it's Hindi, Marathi, Malayalam, Telugu, Bangla, etc. And I see the number of people who are reading content on that. It's like one writer who's writing horror. The number of people who read are something like 14.5 lakh people. I mean, for me, I just felt difficult. Who are these 14 lakh people reading this one writer who's writing this one series of horrors? But it's 800-word stories. It's like the old sort of serializing thing. So once a week, one story is posted by the writer and uploaded. And people keep reading and reading and reading, and then they like, and then other people come by to say, oh, everyone's reading this, let me also read it. And then it builds into a series, and it just gathers momentum. Now if that's possible, that means there are readers out there, but maybe English language publishers, maybe they're not finding those people, maybe they're not publishing to them. And there is a gap between what they want to read and what we are providing for them. How to fill that gap is a question.
I think that with numbers, we have to be a little careful. So when you say, Anna, that India is the second or third largest, this is a statistic that has been around for the longest time, ever since I joined publishing. And yet, in the last 40 years, there has been no systematic study of Indian publishing to look at what the figures are like in which language. In the one study that was done in 1972 by NCAER, the National Council of Applied Economic Research, it was called the Survey of the Indian Book Industry. That was what this statistic, that established this statistic and also separated out the languages in India. So English was about 20% of India's publishing was in English, 35 was Hindi, and then there was other languages, and all the Hindi publishers rejected this, saying, no, Hindi is bigger than English because Hindi is like 400 million people and English is only 5% of India's population. So we couldn't make sense, and I think that this figure of, I know that this figure of the third largest includes textbooks. So if you were to take out textbooks, it would be much smaller, and therefore this question of where is the reader, who is the English reader? I think, as Karthika says, there are readers lurking beneath every stone and in every nook and cranny. We just don't know about them because we haven't really done a study. And this is again something, if the state was invested in it, they would commission an agency to do this kind of study. Nielsen does the occasional, what they call book scan, but it's completely faulty because what happens in Nielsen is you have to subscribe to their service and then they count you. If you don't subscribe to their service, they don't count you. So people like us don't come into any counting. None of us can afford to subscribe. So the entire Nielsen book scan leaves out the entire independent publishing industry. So it can't be a realistic, it's very interesting for the kind
because I thought that their focus is the retailer, so whatever the retailer sells will come out.
Yeah, but the retailer also does not sell, and whenever they're doing a survey, they will really only look at those people who are subscribers to them. In the studies that Nielsen has done in the past, they've hardly ever gone and spoken to any independent publisher. So they're not interested, it's too small.
Yeah.
Because they are counting numbers. When you're counting, so I'm not blaming Nielsen for it.
No.
I'm saying if you're counting Amish with 3 million and you're counting a publisher with 1,300 copies, I mean, why would you? And what kind of frame would you take that can accommodate those two realities? You can't have that. So you have to have something that makes sense in the terms of the study that you're doing. And in that, then a lot gets left out. It's like when you look at a set of statistics about women in India, you will see terrible stuff, and it's all true. Terrible in workforce participation rate is falling, violence against women is rising, etc., etc. But the truth is, those statistics plus the nuanced and very complex stories that lie behind them. That will tell you about women's courage, their resilience. That will tell you that workforce participation rates may be falling, but women are working more than ever. They are working in 10 jobs in a day, and that doesn't get counted. So I think statistics is a good window, but not the only window. It's a long way to say that.
Statistics can always be used for the purpose that I designed. So, what kind of books would you ideally like to publish? If you were given a choice. 3 hands. Poetry.
Poetry for sure, fiction for sure. Biographies, a lot more biographies and history, a lot more history, because again, we have very, very little accessible history writing compared to what could be. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't, and there have always been historians working in that space, but taking it out to people who can access them, that's been so little. Now that's blossoming, and I find myself really enjoying working in that space. It's fun. But also fiction that is not just a literary novel, but crime. I mean, this country, reading the newspapers is like reading a crime. Well, every morning, but we don't have many crime writers. We have a few, but no like series of crime novels and so on that you just automatically say, oh, great, the new one is out. That's not enough. So there's a lot of stuff that we could do, speculative fiction, essay, so much to do. But somewhere is that chicken and egg thing. You want to commission into it, but then you see that this data really destroys publishing at one level. Because when you go out to commission a book, you look at what else has sold in that segment. And then you look at it and say, oh no, that book sold 1,000 copies, or they sent a new novel. How am I going to do this? And sales and marketing is like, okay, that previous book sold 1,000 copies, so you'll probably sell 500. Like, how are you going to justify all the money you will put into printing and publishing and editing and designing this book and not get anything back for it? So then you say, okay, fine, I won't publish it. So the moment you find something that works, then everybody wants to publish it, right? So then most of the big publishers will put a lot of money into that advance, they pay higher royalties, they do anything to get them. Which means, again, then the competition is limited to like 2 publishers or 3 who have deep pockets, and the rest get left out. So as the book gets popular, as a writer gets popular, you will find that sort of magnetically, it just goes to the monopoly again. And then the smaller publishers want to publish more in that segment, but they have suddenly lost the ability to do it. So they are again out of it.
And you? And
Zuban, well, I think lots of stuff. I'd love to do more stuff with feminist humor, feminist romance, feminist crime. I'd love to do more autobiography and biography, and autobiography particularly of women on the margins of society. I'd love to do more for young women. Then I would love to do more, and we are doing a lot of these things, but slowly. But it would be nice if somebody just came and said, here, take 2 crores and do whatever books you like. No, that would be very nice.
I actually would like that.
But there isn't anyone who will do that. So, for example, fun histories of the women's movement so that these become subjects that can be studied, graphic stories, and we are doing now a 100-year history of the women's movement in graphic stories. So let's hope that that gets picked up somewhere. And also basic books. I would want to do books that do a feminist take on so many current issues today. So in my head, these are called Zuban primaries, and we are starting to do them. But looking at, for example, international relations, nuclear war, just war, looking at nationalism, looking at sexuality, looking at consent, identity, all these issues that are such broad issues today, to do short, explanatory, easy to read things on them.
Like the Oxford Short Introduction.
A little different, but yes, I mean those are 25,000 words. We have done these kind of pamphlets earlier. Like what is sexuality, what is gender, what is patriarchy. But those subjects have been, done by many people. So I don't want to go there, but I want to move beyond that to things that are just things that what is the family, what is marriage, what is love. What's the body, these kind of things. We talk about these kind of things. And possibly with illustrations. So there's so much, I know, as Karthika said, she's got many more years than I have.
I'd like to redo the entire classical comic tradition that we have and just do some new ways of reading the old stories. I mean, we've all grown up around Kathas, but it's been a while now. So, just talking about the way the female body, for instance, there's so much to be said for the way they do that. And we still have only those books to look through. How are you going to untrain the young mind if you're going to give them the same stuff again and again? But we need funds for that. We need money, we need, to print colors, rulers, numbers. We need a lot of money. So back to money again.
So then how does Indian publishing in English fit into the worldwide publishing scene? Given our constraints, given the difficulties the independent publishers have, and the problems that trade publishing has, because even though they might be big bucks back there, they're not coming through to you. So how do we then, what is the mark we make? If you make one?
I think one of the interesting things about Indian publishing in English, Karthika pointed this out as well, is that the multinationals who came into India basically focused on Indian writing. So even though somebody like me criticizes them a lot and grumbles about them and is terribly jealous of the money they have but doesn't want to be like them, all of those things. But I still am really appreciative of the fact that they have given a real push to Indian writing in English and also to translations from Indian language into English. That helped, because of their connections, to take Indian writing to the international stage in many ways. What also helps is, when I joined publishing, it used to be, publishing was called a lala industry because that word was used somewhat insultingly, but it was really a family business where nobody really knew about publishing. They just stepped into it because they were booksellers in the British regime. And they thought, okay, now the publishers are gone, we'll do publishing, and so on. So the line of inheritance of businesses was through families. And nobody had any professional training. The real change in publishing came when people like Karthika began to join publishing. And I'm not saying it only because she's sitting on stage with me, but there's no training in publishing in India. But from Karthika's generation on, you see systematically the entry of young people, mostly women, remarkably, and curating content. So even though there's that damn thing called the glass ceiling, which is to do with finance, I think the women have effectively cracked and broken through that glass ceiling where cultural, literary curation is concerned, because pretty much all the major publishing houses have women as their top editors and publishers. So major and smaller ones. So in a sense, that began to change, and the fact that these people, these young people, are also international world citizens who have a facility to communicate outside, to travel outside, they attend book fairs, etc. That has given Indian literature in English a place in world literature, which I think is quite significant. It may not be huge, it changes. There was a time when India was flavor of the month, much less so now. But even so, it's not disappeared, it's not insignificant. So, given all the constraints and all the problems, it's remarkable that this has happened.
Yeah, and I also think that on the one hand, exactly what Urvashi said. But the other interesting development over the last many years in Indian publishing has been that where, for instance, when I started out, it was so important to get my writers into an international space and be trying to sell rights at the Frankfurt Book Fair to other languages, including English. But somewhere along the way, the interesting thing is that we have turned away from the world and found that we, by publishing for Indian readers with Indian writers, is actually where the profitability lies, and not publishing internationally, because the moment somebody has an international agent, they're only giving you the subcontinent rights or the India rights. So you have to sell here. And while they may sell a large number of those books around the world, but in India you will sell certainly only that much. So it's not as if you're making a lot of money with that. You're building brand, you're building prestige, you're building sort of bridges, all of that, yes. But then the moment Indian writers began to rule the Indian bestseller charts, then it was like everything changed in terms of impact and profitability. So then everybody started to say, let's go after what sells here. And that's the big significant shift that's happened.
Earlier, there's also this that we claim as Indians several authors who are based elsewhere, and then we speak very proprietary of it. And
We don't only claim as Indian authors, we claim the British Prime Minister as
That
well.
was yes.
We're very quick to do that.
So when we do that, and there are lots of Indian authors now who are doing very well, even the popular abroad. So thrillers, they're writing adaptations of Shakespeare, they're doing all kinds of things. And where do we fit in that world as well, which we claim as ours?
Where do we as
Publishers here, do we have anything at par with those ones? Because I was looking at a Guardian list of best books for 2022, and they had an Indian author who was writing thrillers called The Cook, The Waiter, and two in the series so far, Ajay Chaudhary. Then there was, of course, a few years ago, there was Preeti Taneja who wrote a Dear adaptation. So when we look at these, and these are not the Booker Prize winners, these are not the major prize winners, but these are Indian authors writing in separative or duets, and they're doing well. But what was
not very much here, I think. Obviously, the Rushdis and Aligas and whatever, those guys have worked very, very well. But a lot of these writers, I find them on websites or on social media or LinkedIn. I'm like, oh, who's this? And I go look for them, and they're actually available in India through their publishing arm, whoever it is here. And then I look at the best and the list, the number of copies they've sold, and they're fairly minimal. Like even big books that have got like awards, which have been reviewed by New York Times, etc. You come back here and you see 2,000 copies. So it's that one A-list category, as they call them, which is the literary novel, the higher-end literary novel, that and the Rushdie sort of Naipaul. Those are the ones that have Jhumpa Lahiri sells a lot. Chitra Banerjee sells. Yeah, Chitra Banerjee is practically assimilated now into, because she also writes about like India, history, popular figures, mythology, etc. So yeah, but the numbers are surprisingly small for the majority of writers who are well reviewed and sold there.
It's a little bit, I thought I might add here a bit about academic books, which I'm sure Srinath would have mentioned to you if he had been here. But there is now a huge South Asian, largely Indian diaspora out in the Western world, and not only in the Western world, but also in the Southeast Asian world, in Australia and other places. Many of them are academics who write, who teach South Asian studies and so on, and who write. Interestingly, for many of them, the field they work on is here. That's where they do their empirical research. And then they produce the study where they live, because in the academic career path, they need to have the legitimacy of having been published by a local university press. So they will be with all the university presses. But for them, in terms of the credibility of being recognized as authentic, I use the word within quotes, and I'm not being critical, I'm just stating that this is what happens. And to basically, because they will continue to do their research here, right? So they want to come back here and they want that credibility here. It's very important to have their books available here at local prices. So they will be seeking out local publishers who can publish an edition of their book here. These are very small editions, maybe 500 copies, sometimes even 300 copies and such like, but it's extremely important for them. We find that all the time with the feminist academics in the States and in the UK and other places. We get any number of requests, will you publish our books here? And then because they have sometimes university grants, they can actually help you with the amount it takes to buy the rights from there, and you can then bring out a small edition of the work. So this is something quite interesting, and I don't know if you're all familiar with this. There was this big discussion on a book that really is quite a solidly good book on Kashmir and on mental health in Kashmir, which was written by an academic based in the States, published by Duke University Press. And then it turned out that her father had been in RAW in Kashmir. And there was this whole thing of, so for her it was really important to have the book published, and she had a local publisher. And then just before the local publisher put the book into the market, or they put a limited number of copies, this thing emerged that she apparently, and I don't know what the truth is, had now declared to her interviewees that her father had been part of RAW in Kashmir or something. And that book's life in this country was destroyed as a result of that. And that impacted her career and, of course, her further research. So there's a whole different dynamics operating with academic books. It's quite significant.
So I would like to tell the audience as well that Urvashi was very good and very generous in telling us that if you have questions about academic publishing and IWE, she would be happy to field them because Srinath could not stay for that session. So if anybody has any questions on academic publishing in India, in English, they could be addressed to her. So, if now any questions from the audience, we could wrap it up. Yes, please.
My question is how institutions or concepts like world literature affect publishing and production of Indian literature outside and inside the country.
How concepts like world literature affect publishing in English, inside and outside the country.
I thought that was an outdated concept.
No, like institution of world literature, Harvard.
Okay.
How they are bringing or taking out selected authors from India or around the world, like from Indonesia, and representing or curating them outside for US market or UK market. How does it affect publishing inside and outside?
It would be difficult to say. I don't think, so for example with Harvard, you know that they received this grant from the Murthy Foundation to do translations of Indian classics and so on the pattern of the Lane translations. What was the man saying?
Sure.
No, the earlier existing translations that existed. I've forgotten now. It's Lane's writing. But anyway, and those books were made available in India at quite affordable prices. So within academia, they were of course appreciated. Within publishing, many publishers thought, yeah, why the hell don't they give a grant to us? Why do the Murthys go out and give it to Harvard? And that is a question. And that is part of the old colonial thing that you feel that quality is only associated, outside. And it's not nice. But they feel, Harvard feels they're doing a great thing for India, so the white guys coming in to rescue us, that syndrome I think is partly still there, but partly they are doing a good job of those translations. They are picking up interesting languages and so on. In the early days, when Indian publishing was not, and I'm sorry I keep going back to the early days, but when Indian publishing in English or Indian writing in English was not as big as it is today and as diverse as it is today, there were only a few publishers abroad who published Indian writing. Systematically, it was only Heinemann. You know, Heinemann used to have that series, Asian and African and other writers. They published a whole range of writers, but otherwise it was basically, and Jonathan Cake was a friend of Nantara Sehgal, so he published Nantara Sehgal, and somebody knew somebody else, they published them, and then they became their publishers. But other than that, the systematic publishing was in this, as far as I know, only in the Heinemann list. I don't know of any others. That list died a long time back. At that time, nobody was jealous of it because, of course, we weren't doing anything like that. And people were appreciating that at least those books were out there.
Sometimes I wish we could go back to those days. At least there would be some books available and made available. Now it's like one sea of books from all over the world, and everything has to go is decided on and judged by the same parameters. Like an editor sitting in the US or the UK will want that book to sell or appeal to reviewers, and who's going to review it positively, who's going to buy it. But obviously, books are going to be different, then they're not going to be judged by the same way. But they are, because they are not being looked at as we want to publish from this place or that place. It's just, do they fit today's criteria? So, like somebody said a few months ago, they were like, if you have a book from Ukraine, yeah, sure, we'll be able to license it. India, actually, nobody's interested in India anymore. So then when we look, a few years ago, it was Nigerian writers. Everybody wanted Nigerian writers, you know. So it's like wave after wave. If you fit it, you get published. Otherwise, you don't. That's it.
But there's this very interesting book I've been reading, Life of, what's it called, Here and Hereafter, on Nirmal Verma by somebody called Vinit Gill. And one of the points that he makes is that the category of world literature was a fairly anodyne kind of category, which really wanted to present palatable, not culturally rooted literatures to the world when writers were writing for an international audience, so they were dumbing down a lot of the cultural things. And when Karthika was talking, I was reminded that there was a time that we were trying to sell foreign rights on one of the books we published, that is this domestic workers autobiography called A Life Less Ordinary. And she talked about, she faced like many, poor women in India, huge amount of violence every day, but because she faced that violence every day and it was so routine, she wrote about it in a routine manner. It was like, yeah, I went home and my husband beat me and then I cooked the khana and then I fed the children and etc. etc. So this book did quite well across the world, but in Britain, the publisher looked at it for a long time and then came back to me and said, sorry, we can't make it work for us because, these misery memoirs, that's what they call them, work really well, but this one just isn't miserable enough. So what they wanted was for it to be really, gratuitous violence and her weeping and such like. And on another book that we were trying to sell, they said the story is great, but there are just too many characters. You Indian, how do you have so many characters in your life? What do you do? Our lives are populated by aunts and uncles and cousins and whatnot.
Interestingly, this time when I was in Frankfurt, people were not so interested in writing in the English. They all wanted to know if there was any translation.
Yeah.
Because Gitanjali history.
Not just Gitanjali history, I think overall there's this thing that...
There's an interest.
Yeah, there's an interest in and they want to translate not via English, but they want to translate. So like a Polish publisher said, no, I can do Bengali and I can do Tamil at this point because I've found translators in these two languages, but everything else I just don't have translators in Poland or someone who can do it into Polish. So I'm going to have to pick something from there. So those things will then decide what gets published as well. What's current, but also what's available, what talents you can get. So it's interesting though, right? They're not, in English, they're like, okay, whatever. There's so much English.
And there's so much English from so many
all over the world.
Yeah.
What is your USP? Your USP is the languages. So it's taken a while to get here, so it's good that they're here.
So now questions.
Hello. I want to ask your suggestion about such readers who don't have a good English background, but they want to read English stories. They feel such difficulties when they buy a book and study it, and somehow they lost between the lines, and they move to audio story. I found that audio story like more connected than reading a physical and read a book. So they buy a book and lost the lines and go for audio story. So they are moving from this such text. So what would be a suggestion about such videos? How they could try to read what audio story or audio visual.
Do you think there's a particular value to reading the book as opposed to listening to an audio?
Yes.
Why?
because when reading, such other imaginations also come in our mind. Not when listening, like it's mainly focusing on the story, and it's the imagination is limited some certain time.
I actually find audiobooks really fascinating because if you have you listened, has anyone listened to The Sandman on Audible? It is the most fantastic audiobook. I mean, just fantastic. It's like every aspect of it, from the storytelling to the voices to the sounds to the background, you feel like your whole body is invested in that story when you're listening to it. And that's, I mean, of course, I love the Sandman book form, but I have to say this was a superior experience. And so maybe one doesn't necessarily have to say, oh, how can I sort of force myself to be a reader? As long as you're getting it from audio or audio visual or whatever, I just say it's okay. I don't know if that's the right thing to say, but
I would also add to that, see, if you think back, although of course it's not your generation or mine or anything, but we come from an oral culture. We come from long established traditions of listening and hearing and absorbing through that. And the act of listening is not a passive act. It is an act of absorbing what is being said and conjuring up the pictures. Because really, what is happening when you're reading words on a page? The words are asking you to imagine something, right? They're saying, the words are saying the sun was setting and the sky was aflame and the trees were silhouetted. Now you can't see all this, but you're actually imagining it. When you're listening, it's saying the same thing to you. So you're using just a different faculty to absorb the same thing, and perhaps in using that faculty, you are also somehow absorbing the atmosphere of it, especially if there is sound being used. So I would say that your concern about reading being a more active act than listening, which may be a more passive, I don't think so somehow. And I think what has happened is that because we so, once a word appears on a printed page, it acquires a kind of permanence. And that permanence gives it a kind of legitimacy and authority with something that seems ephemeral, I'm using it in quotes, which is the voice, does not have. So, in a sense, we invest the written word with a lot of weight, but maybe that's not necessarily true. And if the act of listening in our culture had not been so significant as it is, how could we have heard and passed down all the wisdom from all the books that now exist in book form? After all the religious books, and I'm not only talking about Hindu scriptures, were spoken before they were written. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know if that. I'm just thinking around your question.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that I remember grumbling to someone about how people are reading less, children are reading less, and reading is going down, etc. And this person asked me a very pertinent question. She said, as a child, you may have read, but did your mother read books when she was like a child? When she grew up to choose her books, that's different. And I was like, no, I think my grandmother would have told her stories. So she said, if you're not saying that people are reading less, you're saying that over one generation, people suddenly started reading. And then the second generation is either reading differently or reading maybe a little, like some kinds of people who used to read are not reading anymore, some more are reading. But there's not enough time for us to be able to say, oh, this great tragedy of reading. And then it really took me aback when she said it like that, and I thought to myself, this is true. We've been reading for one generation or two. So what is the point of mourning about reading not sustaining? This is the tiniest phase in our storytelling lives, this little bit. But we've been telling stories for centuries before that. So maybe it's okay, let this form pass, something else to come along, but the story remains, the telling remains, the hearing remains, the listening remains. the learnings remain, and that is the valuable thing. That's it, yeah. So really, it's okay. Ephemeral, paper, ticket, doesn't matter.
You have to listen to lots of audiobooks.
Exactly.
I had a response from that to audiobooks and to podcasts. And it's interesting to think how none of these are really new, really 21st century things, because early on in the 20th century, the great age of the radio, a lot of the plays in America and Britain were made for the radio. As in, for example, T.S. Eliot wrote Murder in the Cathedral for the BBC. And a lot of the American plays were telecast via radio. This was also a time when a lot of Shakespeare was read. So, as in, we have audiobooks today, but then the BBC produced a lot of it in Britain. So, it's interesting to think how it evolves over time and how, and even newsletters, for example, as in a lot of the academic journals, as in the area I work in is periodicals. So, the Victorian periodicals newsletter was perhaps a pioneering journal in the area. The term newsletter was there in the late 60s when the journal began. So, it's interesting to see how these terms they accrue a certain currency over time, and they are not something that are very recent, but then they keep evolving over time, and how they tend to connect to a past in communication, in publishing, so to say. I mean, publishing, I'm thinking of the term in the sense of making something public, basically. So yeah, this is response while you're thinking of audiobooks and newsletters.
To say something more about audiobooks, I think personally, when I'm listening to audiobooks, I can do other things while listening to audiobooks. So I'm doing chores in the house, doing something else while listening to the audiobook, while being immersed in that story world, while I cannot possibly read and do the dishes at the same time. While and when I'm on the move or when I'm walking, and I can listen to the book, which becomes far more difficult to do with the device on the hand and to read. So I think my kind of hyper-attentive, distracted kind of reading, when I am in that phase, I prefer the audiobook. And especially when I'm reading fantasy or epic fantasy, which does not require too much deep attention. So a literary novel probably I cannot read via audiobook, because it might possibly require far more deep attention to words and far more wordplay, etc., which I might miss while listening. But a novel like a fantasy or sci-fi novel, which predominantly is involved in some form of action, is far more easier to listen to, I find, in my reading of audiobooks. So I think this, where we have this kind of window through which we look at things even in the digital variant, where there are multiple tabs and we are moving through tabs sequentially, and the whole desktop metaphor, the window to the world. So when we look at the world through the window, it's not that we're looking at one thing, we're looking at different things all at the same time. So even in the desktop, we're looking at multiple tabs at the same time. So I think that translates to our reading of books. I don't know if it's conscious or unconscious or subconscious or anything, but I think that has somehow changed the way we read and what we read.
Also, but as you said, that in today and this moment, one may want to read an audio, listen to an audiobook. Tomorrow, one may just be able to say, no, today I want to spend with a physical book. Tomorrow, I may want to read something on a Kindle. It's just amazing how much is available to us. We just never had this. I mean, if you didn't have a good bookshop which was accessible, you didn't have access to books. Now you can sit at home and you can literally browse the world and find what you want to read. It's extraordinary. So it's like there's so much that's there, and yet we are mourning the loss of reading. So that is the sad part. That we should be just saying, look, the tools are there, the technology is there, the access is there, everybody's reading more. Which is what the UK and the US were saying about books in the pandemic time, especially. Everybody was saying this. Their sales shot up, they sold 50% more, 100% more books. In India, we just sold less. We just read less. So there's some, culturally we seem to be not.
Also because in the early days books were not recognized as essential services. They were not, Amazon was not sending books out, Flipkart was not sending books out. That's also the thing about state support, no? And like in state, you say, okay, kitabin to free, no?
It's not considered that, yes.
Essential services.
This advancement of audio-visual electronic technology also taking this enlightened man applies math, where iconic or visual or audio has more effect on the man than the written word. Is it so?
Is that the terminology? I don't know. I mean, when you use that particular, are we going back to something?
Yeah,
Or are we just moving into another form of something new?
No, like going back to orality but with technology.
Oh,
The written word made us alienated from the social life but connected with the world of letters, and now we have the visual books or audio books, and then we can now connect with the social life.
you know, I don't know if you, maybe it wasn't, certainly in my lifetime, I remember a time when audiobooks were not so unusual. That is, let's say 20, I would say 25, 30 years ago, when the audio cassette came in, and audiobooks then moved to the audio cassette, and a lot of us were listening to audio cassettes on our little, I call them walk persons, because I don't want to call them walkmans. So we were listening on those devices.
It was a nice word, the walk person. Where did you find a better word?
It's a very nice one. Once you get used to it, it's like you have to just like, you just have to make that imaginatively. But why didn't that work that well? Partly because you had to, just as you said, you were saying, you had to sit somewhere and listen, find the time to listen. And then, unless you stopped that machine at exactly that point and did not put anything else into it, so you could, if you read the book after 3 days, you couldn't listen to anything else after that or something, because then to put the cassette back and get the same point to start, and it was a bit cumbersome. Today, it's so much easier, right? So it's not as if we are going back to orality. The oral methods were always there. As you have said, on the radio, there were so many talks, so many books actually that were read on radio. And even if you look at All India Radio's the old programs, you will find lots and lots. There's one mosquito on the stage. It keeps coming and sitting on your forehead trying to fight. So I don't think it's going back. I think it's just, whatever becomes possible through a range of circumstances at a particular point, that I suppose succeeds. And we didn't know till about 3 years ago, 4 years ago, nobody knew the audiobooks would be such a big thing, but today they are.
Yeah. Also, social is actually possibly the wrong word, because we're just digging deeper into isolation through this technology. We're not going to nature, we're not going to social worlds, we're going towards internal, a very large social world virtually, but not actually sharing anything in personal, actual real time. So I think we are becoming more and more isolationist rather than social. Yeah, virtually social in a very one-dimensional way, because you only show the world what you want to show of yourself. There's always a filter, there's always nice lights, and the colors are changed according to what you want your mood to be shown as. You couldn't do that disguise if you were actually interacting in personal space in real time. So that element of deception that is creeping into it is also something that is quite dangerous, I think, for actual social interaction.
It's a bit tired, exhausted.
I have a few people to thank, and on behalf of IWE Online, I have a few people to thank, but none more than Ms. Urvashi Butalia and Ms. BK Karthika and Srinath, who couldn't be with us. He had to leave, unfortunately. But then thank you so much for coming, for accepting our invitation, for being so kind, and for those two amazing talks, fascinating. I mean, we have all read about you, heard of you, have been told about all of you by a lot of professors of ours, but then to have you here, and it's amazing for all of us as students to be able to ask you questions, to respond to your questions, comments, and so on. Thank you so much for that. And let me also thank the head of the Department of English, Professor Murli Manohar, who was with us in the session, in the first half of the day. All the faculty members of the Department of English, thank you so much for coming. And we are in the audience for the first two sessions. We also had Ms. Richa Chadda, who has designed the IWE online website and is also a social media consultant. Thank you for coming. And a big thank you to our technical team who did the video recording of the event. Thank you so much for coming and recording everything. Thank you. And a big thank you to the staff of the Dean School of Humanities and also the people in the auditorium, in the School of Humanities auditorium, for arranging the mics, the speakers, and so on. Thank you. Everybody in the Department of English, the office staff of the department, thank you so much. And all the students, the MA students as well as research scholars, for coming. And we hope to have you back on the 9th and 10th when we have workshops also as part of IWE Online. And Lavoni did the posters for us. She's a PhD student at the department. Thank you so much. And perhaps most importantly, all our volunteers, Saurav and Noah, Manoj, Shaheem, and Khushbu. Without them, it is virtually not an exaggeration to say that none of this would be possible. They are the ones preparing, as in helping us with the food, with everything, as in they're running around constantly with the photographs. Thank you so much, because none of this would be possible without any of you. So once again, thank you for coming. Thank you so much.